pleasure.
I guess I hit continue here instead of leave meeting. You know.
Exactly. Oh man, Tim Hagans. Wow. Wow. It's great to meet you, man. It's great to meet you.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's my pleasure. You know,
It-
I've been listening to your music and watching the videos, and it's very inspiring. You know,
wow.
the video I watched this morning with you and Dara, it was great. I wish it had lasted longer.
Oh
You
man.
know.
Wow. Thank you, man. That means a lot coming from you, man.
Oh well,
I'll tell you, man, you blew my mind. I was 19 or 20 years old when I heard Hub Songs. That was my introduction to your playing, you and Marcus Printup, and both of you guys knocked me back so far. And just we'll talk about that later. But
okay. Okay.
man, I'm happy to get to talk to you today. A brand new record is out, a conversation. We're going to talk about that. But first of all, I got to ask you about Thad Jones, man. I don't get to talk to too many people that knew Thad Jones, much less had that direct contact and tutelage from him. Talk about meeting him if you can, and what did you learn compositionally that you could share being with such a just a brilliant mind like that?
Well, talking about Thad is one of my favorite subjects. So I'm glad we have a chance to talk about Thad. And I have a question. How much time do we have if I'm going to start talking?
Take your time. Take your time, Tim.
Well, you know, before I met Thad, I heard the Vanguard band, Thad and Mel, as it was called then, several times at the Vanguard. I was on the road with Stan Kenton. I played with Stan for almost 3 years.
Okay.
And we'd get to New York several times a year and staying in Midtown at the Edison Hotel. And back then there were 3 sets. The third set started at 1 in the morning. So if we had a gig in town somewhere, or maybe we played New Jersey or Long Island and got back into town, we could run down and catch the last set. So I remember seeing Thad up close many times, usually the last set. And it's not there now, but by the pillar on the right side of the stage, the audience's right side of the stage, there used to be like a radiator or some kind of like little ventilator thing. And he would sit there when he wasn't conducting and just like he was part of the audience listening to the band, you know. So my first impressions of Thad were, you know, before I met him. And after I left Stan Kenton, I moved to Europe. This is 1977, and I lived in Malmo, Sweden, which is the 3rd largest city in Sweden, and it's in southern Sweden. At that time, there's a bridge now that connects Sweden and Denmark, but at that time you had to take a boat. It was like a 45-minute boat ride from Malmo to Copenhagen, and Thad had been hired to lead the Danish radio big band, and I was subbing in the band quite often for one of the 2 jazz trumpet players. And so that's where I met Thad the first time, subbing on the band. But I remember the night before I played with him for the first time with the radio band in Copenhagen, I was playing a quintet gig at Montmartre, which is the big jazz club in Copenhagen, the main club. And he came in. He had just come into town, and he came in, and there were like 5 people in the audience, and Thad was 4 of them, you know, figuratively speaking. But he was very complimentary, and I said, well, I'm going to play tomorrow with the band, and he was very welcoming. So that's how our relationship started. And you know, people ask me my influences, main influences. Of course, I've been influenced by everybody who played the trumpet and almost every other instrument as well. But the 4 trumpet players that are really my influences are 3 of them are pretty obvious: Miles Davis, Freddie Hubbard, Woody Shaw, and then I always name Thad, and people are surprised a little bit. Especially younger musicians, because if they know about Thad, they know him as a composer and arranger. They played his big band charts. But he was an incredible trumpet player. And if you put like a percentage, this is, of course, is impossible to do. Maybe there's an algorithm or an app that can do this, but if you put a percentage of actual improvisation, and by that I mean playing new things every phrase, Thad's probably, 90% of what he played. And I heard him play many times, working with him in big bands, but also jam sessions and small groups. And it was always like a joyous surprise what he played. And he'd back himself into like melodic corners, harmonic corners, and you'd wonder, well, how is he going to get out of this? And then there would be this incredible 2 or 3 notes to end the line that resolved it back to where the tonal centers went. Lee Konitz was like this too. And I would have loved to hear them play in a quintet together, because, those two guys were like true improvisers, note by note improvisation. And also Thad, the other thing that's in his playing and his writing is this joyous, for lack of a better word, this joyous vibe. And he was really influenced by Louis Armstrong. And when I listen to Pops, I always hear this this personality of the joyous part of life, and even the negatives, the blues, the the hardships can be described as being glad to be alive and to have this gift of life, and I'm going to overcome these things. And I heard that in Thad's playing too, always, and sometimes it was even blatantly humorous. His solo on April in Paris, where he plays Pop Goes the Weasel, is a great example. And I heard an anecdote, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but they'd done so many takes of that in the studio recording. And Thad's thought if he played a humorous quote, Pop Goes the Weasel in this case, that the producer would say, okay, we've had enough, and use one of the previous takes. So Thad played that quote, and that turned out to be the master take that they put on the record. But I don't know if that's true or not. But I heard Thad quote many songs, and it was always, I'd laugh listening to him play, not because necessarily of those kind of humorous quotes, but just because of, like I described before, how he got out of this melodic line and the resolution. It was like the laugh that comes at the end of a hilarious joke, where everything's been leading up to this and you don't know how it's going to end. And like I said, I can go on and on forever about that. But the other thing that I think that I like to mention, and I talk about this when I'm teaching composing and arranging, is that if you listen to Thad's trumpet playing, if you're familiar with his trumpet playing, and you look at like the lead lines that he'll write for a shout chorus in a big band arrangement, or the lead line that the soprano has in a saxophone section solely, those melodies, the horizontal aspect of music, the melodies are coming directly from his improvisational voice on the trumpet. And I visited him quite a few times. He had a house a little bit outside of Copenhagen, and the first time he showed me the room where he writes, and it was an A-frame house, and he had the whole top floor. Okay. And the room was pretty empty except for a long table, score paper, pencils, a pencil sharpener, and an eraser, which it didn't really look all that used, and his cornet. And I said, do you have a piano in the room? He says, no, there's one downstairs. Sometimes I go down and play a few things. But he said, I just, I've got my harmonic concept. I know how I like to voice and orchestrate. But when I'm looking for the lead lines that I'm writing, I just play on the cornet over the changes that are in the song that I'm arranging. And I find ideas improvising over the changes that become the melody.
Wow.
And you think about Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, where, if somebody had never heard Confirmation, they'd never heard Charlie Parker or the tune, and you played them Confirmation, and then afterwards asked them, where does the melody end and the solo start? and they might be hard pressed to find that answer because Charlie Parker's melodies are coming directly from the way he improvised, and Monk the same way. You know, a lot of jazz musicians, of course, draw on their improvisational melodic voice when they're writing, and that's one of the things I really learned from Thad about composing and arranging, is to stay true to your voice. And you know, we're trumpet players, so we can only play one note at a time. So we live in this horizontal world,
yeah,
you know, and then try to find the vertical, the harmonic realms to support the melodies, you know. And I think that's what Thad was hearing as well, was, okay, I have this melody now, what chords will support the power of this melody? You know?
Wow, man.
So
You answered so many of my questions there. I love that. I love that. Thank you, Tim.
Oh
Thank
yeah,
you.
and one final note, he encouraged me to write.
Uh-huh.
I'd played with big bands. I played with Stan Kenton for a long time. I played with Woody Herman for a little while, and various other big bands. And I was kind of, without thinking about it, learning how to arrange, or at least learning the practicalities of orchestration and what's possible inside of a big band. And so that encouraged me to write, and I never studied composition or arranging. And he just said, you know, we'll play it in the band, we'll rehearse it if you'd like to write something, and, you know, I'll give you some hints. And so I just wrote a piece, and I learned from playing with Stan Kenton that if you want your chart played as an arranger, write a solo for the leader.
Okay.
Or his favorite soloists, you know. So I wrote a ballad that went into like a medium swing feel, with Dad playing the melody and playing an improvised solo. And actually, I didn't really write anything wrong. He made a couple of suggestions, and then we ended up playing it on concerts and recording it on a record, which I still think is a great honor, that he would record and actually play on one of my arrangements. The first one that I wrote, actually, called "I Hope This Time Isn't the Last." It's on a Thad Jones Eclipse record, you know. And so I was encouraged to write a second piece, which I did, and I tried all sorts of stuff, and we got about 10 seconds into it, and we couldn't play it. I tried so many idiotic things that he said, well, after the, you know, after the rehearsal, we'll sit down. And he got out his proverbial red pen and just marked all this stuff that wasn't working. And it was like, you know, but that's the way you learn, you know, write things that don't sound well, and figure out why. And that actually was a more important learning experience, actually, than the first chart that I wrote, which I was kind of playing it safe just to see if I could do this, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, no, he was a great inspiration, and very supportive, and just, you know, an incredible person.
Man, that's beautiful, man. That's beautiful. It's interesting too. You know, you mentioned your tenure with Stan Kenton, and then moving to Sweden, you know, relocating to Europe. And I know a lot of players these days are scratching their heads about, you know, how to, you know, earn a living, how to collaborate with large ensembles and big bands, and how to get the commission, and how to forge the relationships. And I know it's kind of a big question, but if you had to advise a young musician on getting their charts played, and perhaps coming to the attention of a noted big band, maybe not, you know, NDR, but someone who is, or a band that is well versed in interpreting guest composers' work, how would you advise them to navigate the terrain of getting their music played and being featured in a context like that?
Well, that's a great question. And you know, the music world is always changing. I started playing with Stan Kenton when I was 19. It was 1974. And back then it was, there were 7 or 8 big bands that were doing one-nighters. I mean, we played every night except for a couple of weeks off during the holidays. And,
Okay.
Ellington was around. I think he died in 72. But his band under Mercer kept going. There was Count Basie, Buddy Rich, Maynard Ferguson, Woody's band. Don Ellis had a band that was out for a while, sporadic tours. And so these were places where composers and a lot of the young composers were playing in these bands so that they knew the vibe and what was needed or what would be accepted. And then with Stan, we did 5 clinics every summer, a week in different colleges. And every day there was an hour where students could bring in something they'd written. Stan said, if you just write one chord voiced for a big band, bring it in and we'll play it. Or if you have an entire chart, but as I said a few minutes ago, the music world is changing. Those bands and opportunities with the bands really don't exist like they did before. And so now there's, several people that have big bands, but they tend to play their own music. Maria Schneider, for example, Bob Mintzer, there are different arrangers and composers for the Vanguard band, the old Thad and Mel band. Lincoln Center commissions and has a variety of people in the band and outside of the band, writing. But it's very difficult because there are so few organizations that commission and actually will. I can't think of any band that plays music from a wide variety of arrangers that has like an open rehearsal where people can just come in and hear their music being played. So the problem is also economic. It's so prohibitive to put together a big band and pay everyone for rehearsing and recording. It's astronomical. So I think one of the ways is to, first of all, have a lot of musician friends on different instruments.
Okay.
And because I've done many like reading sessions. It's just to come and play somebody's music, and it's a hang, and there's a box of donuts and some coffee, and somebody just wants to hear their music. So you can always, if you have people that you feel comfortable asking to do something like that, one can do that. And then also, I think a lot of people now, because almost every university or college has a jazz program and a big band, that's a great way to hear your music. Perhaps not played by professionals on that level, but still you can hear your music live. And I think that's why a lot of people go into jazz programs and even into composing and arranging rather than jazz performance or one of the other areas, so that they can concentrate on writing. And I think in those programs, you're probably guaranteed to hear your music being played. And it's not only hearing your music, but if you've written it, you should conduct it as well. Because that's a great experience to learn. It's one thing to learn how to compose and arrange, but if you are asked to lead a concert at the school or with one of the radio bands in Europe, you can't waste any time. So you kind of have to get your conducting chops together and realize how to quickly assess what needs to be adjusted or was played wrong, or you're hearing it played correctly just as you wrote it, but maybe you don't like it and you want to make an adjustment. You want to open up something or repeat something or leave something out. So how do you communicate this to the musicians very quickly so you can be effective in the rehearsal? Not only time-wise, because maybe you've only got an hour in this room at a college, but also you don't want the musicians to lose interest. And for many years, I was deemed the greatest fourth trumpet player in the big band world. And so I've played in a lot of big bands, and I've fallen asleep in some rehearsals simply because the conductor doesn't know what they want. They have no idea, and they can't articulate what they want. And if you're in a situation where you're under the clock and you've got the musicians for just a specific period, that's also part of being a composer and an arranger. There's a Finnish conductor, Esa-Pekka Salonen,
Mm.
who was the chief conductor of the LA Philharmonic for many years. And I think now he's the composer in residence for the New York Phil. And he became a conductor so that he could conduct his pieces. I read this in an interview with him
Okay.
several years ago, that he was a composer, but he studied conducting and became a world-class, world-known, world-invited, all over the place conductor because he wanted his music to sound the way he heard it and wrote it. And I've had instances where I've left my music left up to other conductors. They do a great job, but there's that personal thing that you feel
Mm.
because you know the origin of what you wrote and what
Right.
you were feeling when you wrote it and the meaning of this line. It might only be a couple of bars, but you know the emotional meaning of those two bars. And to somebody who didn't have that experience of feeling something and then trying to portray that emotion into musical notation for a big band, let's say,
Right.
they're going to regard those two bars to see if they're played correctly or not. Whereas you have this, this emotion, more emotion has to come out. So that's also what I recommend is, and even if you're not going to school in a jazz program, I think depending on the program and who's in charge, hopefully they'd be open to hearing someone's music. And so I think looking to universities is a good way to and make the connections there, whether you're a student or not, just to get your music heard.
Perfect. No, I like that. I like that answer. I like that answer. And as I move into listening to this new work of yours,
Right.
Conversation,
Right.
pointing out this was recorded before the pandemic and
Right.
before most of the calamity of last year and the year before took place. I agree with you philosophically. We need to have more conversations. And
Right.
people were telling me when I was coming up, yeah, university, that's the marketplace for ideas. That's the forum for conversation. But I hear that in music as well. And the first thing I want to ask you about are the unique groupings that you have. This is a
Right.
collaboration, of course, with the NDR Big Band as they promote themselves quite accurately. A band of soloists, a band of creatives,
Right.
you
Right.
hear that right away in what you've written and how they've interpreted it. But as I look at a big band, I'll see sometimes, the trombones up over here, the trumpets up here, and the saxophones down here. You have these unique groupings that you've used throughout the piece to execute your vision. Talk to me about that a little bit if you can, Tim.
Well, I think that music is always a conversation, and in the classical world they have the word concerto,
Mm-hmm.
and the last 200 years or so we've thought about this as being a soloist, a violin concerto featuring a violin soloist and the orchestra. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this conversation between a soloist and the entire orchestra. But in the original meaning of a concerto, 400 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
it was groups in a smaller, they didn't have the huge Mahler orchestras back then, but it was a conversation between different groupings in the ensemble, regardless of how large or small it was. And if you listen to Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, that's a huge orchestra, but there are these groupings orchestration groupings that happen. And if you listen to it enough, you can hear where it's more of the traditional sense of a concerto where different members and different groupings are conversing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I tried to create here with a conversation. And I left it, it could have been called The Conversation, but I changed it before I started writing to A Conversation because it keeps it more abstract. And this is,
Mm-hmm.
it could be four people talking about where they're going to have dinner that night,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be a family deciding what car they want to buy, or it could be a political parties or people within a political party. It could be anything. And I on purpose kept it abstract, not only for the listener, but for myself when I was writing it, because I didn't want to be, I wanted to keep it abstract in my mind. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that I was writing this in the fall of 2016. So
Yeah.
it was especially difficult to achieve that, um, not to write about a specific thing, although there is a little bit of that in there.
Mhm.
But in order to, and what I wanted to do was have different opinions. And I felt that if I gave the trumpet section an opinion, an abstract opinion, and the trombones an abstract opinion, it would not be able to portray the opinion because it's all the same instrument.
Mm.
And so I divided the band up into 3 mixed wind instrument groups. Some of them are 2 trumpets, a bass clarinet, a tenor saxophone, and a trombone.
Uh-huh.
And the next group is maybe 1 trumpet and 2 trombones, and an alto sax. And then, I included all the wind instruments in these 3 groups, but all 3 of them have brass and woodwinds.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, group number 1 is I deemed it kind of the intellectual, searching, well-read, uh, kind of intellectual group,
Okay.
that has the ability to examine whatever the subject is from a very intellectual point, like the nerd point,
Mhm.
And the second group was, there was dissent inside of the second group. And so inside of that group, there's some arguing going on about the concept that they're going to portray. And even if these are, like I said in the beginning, 4 people deciding where they're going to eat dinner, one person could be very opinionated and intellectual, and all the information that they've gathered has given them this opinion that they're not budging on. Whereas the second group could be 1 person that can't decide, likes Indian food, but also would like a big steak. And it's like, okay, they have to think, well, tonight, what would I like? Well, I had Indian food 3 days ago and I really shouldn't eat the steak. So maybe we should go to a Thai, that's the second group.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
eventually that group comes to a definite opinion, but there was a lot of struggle in there. And then
Okay.
the third group is very obnoxious and just kind of, not flexible at all, and has an opinion that's a little radical and brash.
Mhm.
And then the rhythm section, because it already is a mixed instrument group with different orchestration properties and possibilities, became the 4th group and kind of the mediator,
Mm.
because that's kind of the role of of a, of a rhythm section anyway, to keep everything together, to remind people of things, or to say this is where we're heading now. Or if they kind of like what somebody's saying, then they can push that a little bit. So that was the original concept, was to have 3 completely different types of, whether it's 1 person or a group, but
Mhm.
that have an opinion, and then have a conversation with those 3 different vibes, plus a mediating, kind of supporting, reminding a 4th group, which is the rhythm section.
Mhm. I like
And so and then there are 5 movements, and each movement is like a different uh, segment of a conversation,
right.
with
Right.
the first one being presentation of ideas.
Mhm.
And about halfway through the first movement, after the piano solo, um, individuals within the group start expressing their opinions. And I've written themes that are used throughout the entire piece, because these are the ideas that they're talking about.
Mhm.
So each group has a melody and harmony that kind of from the beginning projects the vibe of their group. And throughout the 5 movements, these themes appear in the other groups as they're examining that idea.
Mhm.
And so the melody becomes a little different, or the intervals become a little wider, because this is the group saying, well, I heard what you said and I agree with some of it, but I think it should be like this. And then the third group, which is the idiots and the inflexible people, they come in and clamp that down with their, So it was a lot of fun to play back and forth between the groups and the exchange of ideas, which I represented with melody, harmony, and rhythm, of course.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and the, you know, the second movement was, after this long first movement, it was kind of like a respite. Okay, everybody said what they're going to say. Let's think about it a little bit and examine it and take a little break. And then the third movement gets a little more active and a little more arguing.
Yes.
And the fourth movement is a very slow blues that
Mhm.
is kind of like this thing where you might feel, if you've been in an argument where you said something you shouldn't have, or you've overstepped your boundary, you know,
Mhm.
and just like feeling a little like, I don't know what the word would be, but regretful, and hope that you didn't offend anyone and can still get your point across, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the fifth movement is just about hope and coming together and trying to find a consensus.
Man.
And of course, the last note, you know, portrays whether you actually came to a complete 100% consensus or not. So,
Man, this
you
is
know,
incredible. And it's crazy to have you confirm a few of my notes in the third movement. I was listening and I'm like, I hear some echoes of Gretchen Moncour, Alan Shorter, this plotting thing that happens at the beginning.
right.
And then almost this M1 kind of vibe that happens, after that. And then you talked about the fourth movement of the blues. Automatically, I thought about Mingus and
Right.
blues
Yeah.
and roots and his shouts and his affirmation and the energy and the soul there. And the
Right.
way you end part five, movement five, with this kind of backbeat up tempo thing, man. I heard that second half of part five even as its own tune, like almost like
Right.
the pardon me, but the hit tune of the whole thing. I could hear that having some legs even outside of the big band. But man, this is an incredible vision that you've executed it with just amazing musicians who know each other, but again are taking the time to interpret your music. Man, how long did this take for you to write from start to finish, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. When I received the commission from the producer of the NDR band, Axel Deur, he's
Mhm.
an incredible producer, visionary, and he's supported my requests for commissions and many times. And I also work with the band as a conductor, conducting other people's music, which is very fascinating to learn about other people's
Mhm.
ways of thinking. But in June of 2016, we had been talking about this concept, and he said that he'd like me to write it. And I had these basic ideas floating around for quite a while in my head that I've described about the different groups and the
Mhm.
vibes and the emotions,
Mhm.
but I couldn't write. It was I didn't know where to start.
Mm.
So I gave myself about 6 weeks, almost 2 months, July and August of 2016.
Mhm.
And I read a book by Alex Ross called The Rest is Noise. And
Okay.
Alex Ross is a contributor. He writes about music for the New Yorker, and he's a musician himself. It's an incredible book, and it's really a compendium, a history of 20th century classical music.
Mhm.
Starts in 1900 with a premiere of a Strauss opera, I forget which one, that actually Mahler and Schoenberg attended. You know, and back then, 1900, 1901, there were no recordings. There
Right.
was nothing. If you wanted to hear a new opera
Mhm.
by Strauss, you had to travel by some kind of horse or train to that night when it was being performed. You know, so it's a very anecdotal but very informative book. And I read the book and used it as a listening guide. And even though I've listened to a lot of classical music, there were many things that I wasn't aware of. It kind of put things in order, the influences that were carried on by certain people. And yeah, Alex Ross, The Rest is Noise. And after I read that and listened to all this music, then I felt like I was ready to start. So I started writing in September and October, the first three movements.
Mm-hmm.
And not to, I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but you mentioned part 4, or we could turn it into a political discussion.
Take your
That's fine
time, man.
with
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
But part 4 is a very slow, mournful blues. And that was, and I knew that part 4 was going to be something slow, mournful, a little regretful. Like I described before, maybe I've said something that offended somebody,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, analyzing inward and how to
Mm-hmm.
find hope. And I always thought from the time I kind of became politicized, especially living in Europe, but even before that,
Mm-hmm.
in the 60s, when I was a teenager, I always thought there was 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I saw all this, in this country.
Yeah.
And that interim between the end of writing movement 3 and beginning movement 4 in the middle of November of 2016, that
Mm-hmm.
definitely influenced
Yes, sir.
what I wrote.
Yeah.
And so I finished writing probably the first week of December, movement 5, and ended it with a lot of hope and a lot of energy towards the future, and overcoming
Mm-hmm.
the negative part of the blues.
Yeah.
So it was basically 3 months of writing, not every day, because I can only work in like 45, 50-minute spurts of
Okay.
intense creativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I use Finale, and Finale is a great tool because I can write and I can hear it back. It's
Right.
like having the band waiting in the next room, and you run in with all the parts and say, okay, I want to hear these 8 bars.
Uh-huh.
And then
Uh,
I didn't like they go back and change something. It's an incredible tool, and it's really, because I don't play the piano all that well, it's really expanded the possibilities for me as a writer so that I can actually hear what I'm writing,
yeah.
which is another luxury. You talk about, before we were talking about writing in earlier times, and you
Mm-hmm.
wrote, and I think people sometimes played it kind of safe because they knew this would sound good. They were under a deadline. It was a project. It had to be functional as well as artistic. But when I started using Finale, the sky's the limit. I try all sorts of things. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I've got about 45 or 50 minutes of that, and then I'm out of ideas, and I might go back and put in articulations or crescendos, because to me, I know I've written the melodies, I know what should be played short and long, but in the creative process, I don't want to stop and put in a bunch of accents and dynamics. So if I want to continue after I feel my creative juices have expired, I'll go back in and do some maintenance work and put in articulations and that kind of thing. So, and then some days it's just, the ideas aren't there. And what I
Mm-hmm.
do is I play the piece from the beginning, and when there's no more music on the Finale file,
Mm-hmm.
then it goes blank, and I think, okay, what comes next?
Mm.
And
Okay.
if I get the idea, then I can start.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me 2 months to prepare,
Yeah.
and then 3 months to write it.
Wow. Wow. Man, that's
And
wow.
and we recorded it basically in 5 days. They
Okay.
musicians had the music in advance, and a year later in 2017, we planned a recording week, and so it was done in 4 or 5 hour sessions, and that's really a testament to the quality of those musicians. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, the first rehearsal, they just read everything down, and then we can start recording and
Man,
tweaking things.
that's
It's
amazing.
it's a
That's
great honor to have that association.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you represent well, and you've given them something to really bring out the colors of their collective vision and skill. Um, I do want to ask you one more thing
Sure.
as we go forward and kind of start to make our way, out of this pandemic. Knock on wood. I'm curious about what thoughts you're having musically, and also business wise about you know the agency of creative musicians. We have had a system kind of in place for a long time in the music business, as you mentioned earlier. is shifting and changing, and
Right.
people are trying to find ways to do their work and to perform and to record. Do you think that everything going away like it did, last year and now reemerging will reset musicians in a way that they would not only be forced, but be inspired and also maybe even have more of a landscape to stretch out and do their own recordings and take their career more by the horns? What do you think about that?
Well, I think we have to look at the positives that come out of this, and use them. I'm incredibly disappointed and sorry that this happened. And I think as human beings, and especially musicians being creative animals, we're trying to figure out how to uh, create, to express ourselves, because that's an important part of the way we work in life, is to express ourselves. And I think we all feel like we have something unique to say, and we want to give this as a gift to the people. And I watched the video that you made, episode 1, and you're walking by this beautiful lake, I guess in Nashville, I'm not
Oh,
sure,
wow.
but
Yeah.
and you're talking about communicating with the people, and finding an audience for with people that will appreciate what you're doing. And that, of course, has always been a challenge, but I think even more now, even really in the last 20 years, since uh, things went digital, and
Mhm.
the way people listen to music, but also the way people buy music has totally changed. And it
Mhm.
has not always been positive for the artists
True.
in either of those, in either of those ways, listening or making money off of this music. And it's totally different now than when I came to New York in 1987.
Mhm.
Blue Note had just started after some dormant years,
Yeah.
and it was still the old system. CDs had really just started, and that changed everything, of course, as well. The business model, the way people got paid, but it was still basically the same thing. You had a device at home, and you had to buy the thing that you put in the device. It's
That's
not
right.
an LP or a cassette anymore; it's a CD.
Right.
And then Napster came along, and file sharing, and all of a sudden there was no need to buy music anymore.
Yeah.
And you can get a subscription for so many dollars a month, and you've got everybody's record collection in the world.
Yeah.
And of course, the business model has not been positive towards musicians through the streaming thing. But
Mhm.
that's another whole discussion. So that's what these are the obstacles that we have to overcome. And also because of the demise, not the total demise, but just the recording industry of paying people to record, first of all, and then trying to recoup the money through sales through
Yeah.
record stores. And that's totally changed as well.
Mhm.
So we've all become our own producers, and to do that, we use technology.
Mhm.
And like I said, it was going on long before the pandemic, but now it's really become important, because I didn't drive to Newark today, which I
Mhm.
would have done 2 years ago,
Mhm.
to hang out with you in the BGO studios, like
Right.
I've done before. We're doing this, and people are rehearsing. They're through Zoom and other programs.
Mhm.
My wife, Michelle Brangwin, is a dancer choreographer,
Ah.
and it's contemporary dance. She uses the musicians in the choreography. It's commissioned new music,
Mhm.
and she's been rehearsing via Zoom with 3 different dancers, and I've been getting the music from different musicians, different parts of the country, even a drummer in Denmark
Mm.
that I play with, and mixing the sound together. And then we have access to a rooftop in New York, and we've been filming before vaccinations. We filmed because she and I have a little pod. We filmed the dancers one at a time, distanced, and we all wore masks, you know. And then since all of the dancers are vaccinated, we met on the rooftop and filmed together for this latest project. And so that was a whole learning experience for everybody, is how to create dance and music in this, you know, in this environment. And we're not going to continue doing this as things open up. And I have full confidence that at some point, if certain things happen, we can return somewhat to, you know, the way things were before. But what we're going to take with us are the things we've learned by doing it this way, which is a lot. You know, I can play along with and communicate with musicians all over the world. Whereas before I just thought, well, I'll go to Germany and we'll do this in person. We just got to figure out the finances and, you know, and of course that's still the desired optimum way of doing things with the music that we play. It's, you know, it's great to be standing next to each other, but it's opened up a whole new world of other ways to produce your music. And then through, you know, sites like Bandcamp and SoundCloud, you can promote your music and try to get people to purchase it that way. And that's the problem, is that people have become so accustomed to getting things for free that there's, you know, when I was growing up, and I don't want to sound like the old guy who starts every sentence with when I was growing up, but, you know, I cut lawns, I washed cars. I made $20 a week, and most of that I spent at the record store. That was when I was cutting the grass and washing the cars. I was thinking about the Coltrane record or the Miles record that I hope is still there in the bin.
Me too.
But, you know, that kind of thing. That was what was important. And to admission into clubs and concerts, I spent all of my extra money on learning about this music and at the same time supporting the artists. And so we need support. And I think more people have to talk about the fact that this is not free stuff. You know, we spend our whole lives becoming better and better at what we do, writing, playing instruments, conceptualizing. It's an incredible way to spend a life. And it's very time consuming, and you have to pay the rent and eat. And so if this is still going to be a viable profession, and I think being an artist is one of the most important professions in the world, because it makes people think, you know, art makes people smarter. And so we have to figure out a way to survive. And one way of doing that is buying each other's records instead of, you know, hey man, I'd like to listen to your next CD. Do you have any extras? You know, I mean, you know, comping people to get into clubs, and, you know, we could go on and on about this forever, but I think if you're self-producing something, there has to be some support for that. And we're a community, a worldwide community of jazz musicians. And, you know, the best way to keep that community strong and large is to support each other's endeavors, you know. So I'm still buying things on Bandcamp, and, you know, all of these concerts people did, the tip jar through online concerts, you know, supporting them that way. It's very important, you know.
Absolutely. Tim, I'm going to get you to hang on the line for a second, but it's been my pleasure talking to you today, man. Thanks for letting me put you under the microscope.
Sure.
I appreciate the wisdom, man. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Greg. This has been an incredible pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. I hope we can play together sometime.
Oh, man, that's a plan. That's a plan.
You're laying it down, and you know, man, dude. The trumpet player on one of those tunes, Rob
Magaha.
Yeah. that cat.
He's something else, man.
I hope I can be the trumpet player sometime.
Dude, absolutely, man. Absolutely. Oh, man.